Welcome to the Radical Centrist podcast, where we explore a politics that steps outside of the realm of the poisonous partisanship that has infected our country in recent years. And we seek ways to place the American voice, the American idea, above tribalism, partisan politics, and blind allegiance to ideology. To challenge ourselves to ask questions and seek answers that can bridge the divides between people, parties, and ideologies. Radical centrism is not quiet and meek, but outspoken and unapologetic. Radical centrism celebrates raucous debate, tempered with civility and humility. Fair warning. Be careful when you listen to these podcasts. You may find yourself opening your mind to the possibilities that suddenly come available to us when we listen to one another. This is your host, Wayne King, and my ultimate goal is to create aha moments. If I can just once in a while set off that light bulb, then I have the chance to convince you that there is real value in talking to one another, and more important, in listening to one another. If we listen, really listen to one another, we can find a way to express our American voice, the one that celebrates our common ideals and respects our differences. If we can find our American voice, then maybe, just maybe, we can sing together too. What a joyous sound that would be. So let's get started.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try harder. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch! Got to realize that we could do a bit better. Find more solutions and share with each other.
My thanks to reggae musician Free Joseph for providing the music to us for this podcast from his critically acclaimed CD, He Is Here, singing Tell Me Why. His music is available from his website, freejoseph.net, or from iTunes or wherever you purchase your favorite music.
Well, let me tell you what's at stake here. As I said, Spain had the fourth highest what's called energy density of wind on the grid. That means the percentage of electricity on the grid that comes from wind was the fourth highest in the world. And that percentage reached 19% during the period, during the late 2010s. It's up a couple percentage points higher now, I believe. But anyway, so that seems like a great achievement. It's much higher than what we have in the U.S. But electricity consumption went up by 20%. So you had 19% increase you had 19% of the energy coming from renewables, but 20% of the total, a 20% higher total. And so carbon emissions did not go down. I'm talking about over 20 years of building wind farms in Spain. Carbon emissions did not go down. They went up by 1 percentage point. So what we really need to do is to retire fossil fuels. And that's the most important thing. That's the thing that we need to do to preserve the conditions for life on planet Earth in terms of temperature, in terms of extreme weather events, fire, flood, drought. Most people would refer to those as natural conditions, but they're not natural anymore. They're driven by industry in part. But anyway, in terms of those conditions, we need to retire fossil fuels. Retiring fossil fuels, of course, creates a shortage of electricity in relation to what people consume. So we need to replace fossil fuels with something, and that ideally is wind and solar. Mm-hmm. But what's happening is that we're pursuing the second goal without pursuing the first goal. So what we're doing is continuing with fossil fuels at the same level, more or less, adding wind and solar to the grid in order to accommodate people's higher energy demands. In Spain, during this period of this 20-year build-out, it was people buying microwaves and so on. And we're not actually lowering carbon emissions. So we need to build renewables much faster, and we need to, first off, to make a commitment to retire fossil fuels much, much faster than is happening now.
That is the voice of David McDermott Hughes, Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers University, and the author of Who Owns the Wind, one of the most important books on climate change and the opportunities ahead of us, as well as the dangers in the last 5 years. Now, David has already said that we need to retire fossil fuels as fast as we can and ramp up the use of renewables. But you're going to find out that his book is about much more than that. It's about the nexus between trying to solve the gigantic problems associated with climate change and creating economic and environmental justice and a sense of community where the people who are most impacted by changes that we make also are among the beneficiaries of the changes that we make, and the benefits renewable energies will create for us as a planet. Now, I like the way David says that we need to create the opportunity for a livable climate, because we often hear people say, save the earth. But the truth is, as my Native American brothers and sisters will tell you, the earth will go on. And scientists will tell you the same thing. It doesn't matter whether we're here. The earth will go on. Some things may change. But the question is, will we go on? And that is the existential question that faces us today. So, as I said, the name of David's book is Who Owns the Wind, subtitled Climate Crisis and the Hope of Renewable Energy. And it is definitely one of the most important books on the subject in the last 5 years. And that's one of the reasons why we feature this interview with David Hughes for our 3-month special series called Rediscovering Our Song, a series that focuses the Radical Centrist podcast for the next 3 months on how we seize the moment for change and create a more livable climate for us. In 2015, Hughes found himself frustrated with the slow pace of building out a renewable energy infrastructure that would permit us to decarbonize our economies. His interest in wind energy led him to decide to do a study of the problem by identifying an area where it seemed that they were making better progress than the rest of us. He chose a village in the Andalusia region of Spain and a town to which he attributed the name Sereno, for the purposes of the book. Hughes expected to find that life was all rainbows and unicorns in Sereno as they retooled for a greener future. What he discovered was quite different. The local folks were not really in favor of the towers and the generators, at least not at first blush. But further research led him to conclude that there was more to the story, pointing to a sense that they were being victimized by the process, being asked to sacrifice for a future that saw few or no benefits for them. It led David to the conclusion that economic justice was an important part of the equation for creating a carbon-free future. Today, Hughes remains cautiously optimistic about the hopes for wind energy, but he insists that we will fail in our efforts to decarbonize our energy production if we fail to take into account the need for all of the people to share in the gains of the transition. The answer to the question posed by the book, well, I'll leave that for you to determine from this conversation with David Hughes. Okay, well, I'm speaking with David McDermott Hughes, who has written what I believe is a very important book called Who Owns the Wind? And rather than me trying to summarize it, David, maybe you'd take a few minutes to talk about the book in general and what you think are the sort of main points that you're trying to make for people who read it.
All right, thank you very much, Wayne. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. I'll get across the main points, sure. So I'm an anthropologist, I should say, at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I study energy justice and the transition away from fossil fuels. And so I was very interested in wind power and in what it takes to install more wind farms as part of that transition away from fossil fuels. And so I thought a few years ago, back in 2015, I thought I would look at one of the places where wind power has gone the furthest. And that was Spain, which at the time was number 4 in terms of the percentage of electricity on the national grid generated by wind. It was number 4, if I remember correctly, for renewables altogether. And I found in Spain what is probably at the first or tied for the first as the village in the world most surrounded by wind turbines. I use a pseudonym for it in the book of Sereno. The book is entitled, by the way, Who Owns the Wind? Climate Crisis and the Hope of Renewable Energy. Right. From Verso Press.
Here if I figure out how to do that.
It's a little bit out of focus there, Wayne, but anyway.
I'll get it. There we go.
Oh, there you go. So I thought this place was the future, and that all the villages and towns and cities would be surrounded or full of wind turbines if we actually are going to stabilize the conditions for life on planet Earth. Which is to say, to address the climate crisis and retire fossil fuels. So I was all right. This was like a utopian future for me. I went there and I found that nobody liked the wind turbines, and that 10 years before, between 5 and 10 years before, they'd had engaged in civil disobedience to block the cement mixers and so on, and had mostly failed to put up these turbines. Although when I say mostly failed, the part that succeeded was that the regional government saw this activism and was a little bit afraid of it, afraid enough not to propose any more wind farms after the ones surrounding Sereno. So the activists in Sereno failed locally, but they succeeded regionally. And because this was happening in other parts of Spain too, the energy transition more or less stopped in the 2010s. And very few wind farms were commissioned after that point. The same thing happened in Germany in the 2010s as well. And the same thing has happened onshore in the United States with wind farms, is that it's very difficult to actually install them because of local opposition. So as an ethnographer, I've studied people's ideas. I spent time with people, particularly in bars. It's like most of Spain, a lot of people, particularly men, hang out in bars and talk about politics. And so I found that they opposed the wind turbines for a whole lot of reasons that you'd sort of expect. I mean, the kind of first things people told me was, well, they're ugly, they make noise, they kill birds, they've industrialized our agricultural landscape. And, those are the first things I heard for the first few days. But then on a second round of conversations with people, I began to learn more. And they began to say, well, when we were protesting, we were also negotiating. And what we wanted were jobs and or an income stream from these wind farms. And we actually would have accepted all that noise and ugliness and so on if we'd gotten some economic benefit. But we got no economic benefit at all. And what's worse, the people we really hate are the ones getting the economic benefit. And those people are giant energy corporations in Spain, the now international corporations, as well as giant landlords, because this area has the most unequal land distribution in Europe, which goes back to medieval times, in fact, to the so-called reconquest of the area from Moors. So basically, the economic benefit was grabbed by this tiny elite. And that so angered the majority that they stopped or significantly slowed the energy transition everywhere in the region. So I thought, well, there's a lot of truth to what they're saying. And this is something we have to take seriously. And climate activists, I count myself as a climate activist, have to take this seriously. We can't just discount local feeling in the interests of saving the conditions for life on planet Earth. However important and however much of an emergency the climate emergency is, we're not going to succeed in countries like Spain or the United States if we discount and steamroller over local senses of place and justice, right? So then the book presents a solution in one regard. So there's no reason why the landlords should be monopolizing the benefits to the extent they do. I understand that corporations, having built wind turbines, feel they deserve and doing the actual work of converting the kinetic energy of air into electricity. They feel they deserve a return on that. What have landlords done in this case? Landowners. Well, they've rented out a certain pretty small area of their land for the pads around each turbine, about half the size of a football field. In this area, these are the 2 megawatt turbines, so equivalent to the ones that you have around Antrim in New Hampshire. And access roads. And so these landlords who in this part of Spain are raising cattle have lost some pasture land, and they deserve compensation for that. But they're also getting a form of compensation now, which is royalty payments for what are called wind rights. And so the landlord is acting like an owner of the wind and being compensated for that. Although it's not actually established law in most places that the landlord is lord of the wind also. I think, and I recommend in the book, that this is something that should be contested. And the wind should rather be considered the property of some larger entity, which might be the village of Sereno, or it might be the area crossed by the Levante, which is the east wind in that area, or it might be the area, the view shed around the turbines of the people who may find them ugly, or maybe some larger political entity, but not the person who happens to own the land, because the land is not equivalent to the wind. So I suggest a public commons, a wind commons, I call it, which would then would then share the benefits and would invite all kinds of rural people to benefit from the energy transition, and I think win their loyalty and support for the energy transition, which is what we need, because we need the energy transition to actually happen. There's a second part of the book, the middle part of the book, which deals more directly with those aesthetic concerns. And there, I don't have a good solution. I have some compromises, some ways of thinking differently about turbines, where one might find them to be less of a rupture with the way the landscape used to look, and perhaps a continuation. And that's very site specific. And this part of Spain, going back to the Middle Ages, has a lot of towers and fortifications, cannons and things, which go back to the mid 20th century under Franco. And they don't look. They're steel, they're stone, they're also they're military, they're aggressive. They don't look that different from wind turbines. And it probably in 20 or 50 or 100 years, we'll see wind turbines as part of that aesthetic tradition. But I'd like to accelerate that process a little bit. If you think about New Hampshire, there's the road, there's the cog railway going up Mount Washington. There is a practice. There are ski lifts. There is a practice actually of industrial corridors going up mountains and along ridges in this state for purposes far less worthy than generating electricity from wind, retiring fossil fuels, and preserving the conditions for life on planet Earth. So that's a summary of the book, Wayne.
So in traditional real estate law right now, the assumption is that the landowner owns the rights to what's under his property, and basically a column extending, I won't say infinitely, but extending into the air above that land. And what you're contending is that the value of the wind itself is not enshrined in law. Is there any comparison between that, between looking at wind that way, as we do with bodies of water, for example? It was 100 years ago, nobody even thought about the waters of the Connecticut River or Lake Winnipesaukee or Lake Memphremagog over in Maine, or the ocean as public waters or as public trusts. And now today, for the most part, they are considered the public's land and not the private lands of somebody who, unless they own everything around the waterway.
Yeah, I mean, the public trust doctrine could come into play here and be very useful. I'm not a lawyer, and when you ask me a question like this, I wish I were. But I will say about the air column. Well, first of all, going down, in most countries, minerals are property of the state. It's just some really bizarre anomalies that have to do with the colonization of the U.S. and the role of prospectors, where mineral rights are private in the U.S. And that is quite well established. The air column part is a little bit murky, I would say. I mean, the privatization of the air column rests on originally upon the writings of this jurist from Tuscany in what's now Italy in the 14th century, he was writing about situations where you have a town and there's a guy with a roof who wants to build a second story, and he kind of widens it out so that his shingles are leaning over the plane, the vertical plane, into the imaginary space of his neighbor. And his neighbor doesn't like that because his neighbor then can't even build the roof straight up, right? And so da Pistoia said the landowner owns up to the sky. Mm-hmm. Now, the sky is not actually an elevation. It's a very vague principle that is broken all the time when a plane or a kite, for that matter, flies over your property. I live under one of the flight paths to Newark Airport, and I would love to be able to make those planes go around me, but I can't, right? So this is not a principle that is actually applied, and moreover, owning energy is not necessarily the same thing as owning space. So it's obviously an anachronism, this to the sky principle, and doesn't apply to
Mm-hmm.
circumstances of converting wind energy into electricity. I would say so. It's time to open a discussion then about who owns the wind.
Right. And I think that one of the questions that arises to me uh, is whether or not this should be resolved in how do you deal with sort of the local issues in terms of giving people the feeling that they are attaining value from these wind generators, as opposed to just some more sort of national policy uh, that provides value to everybody.
Well, this is the part that I'm not entirely clear on because it would have to be very situational. I mean, some legislation severing, it's called severing land rights from wind rights from land rights actually would be very useful, whether it's at the
Mm-hmm.
state level or the national level. And then I think you've got to base your decision on, you've got to start from the wind. So if there's a lot of wind that's even, that's constant, and is good for generating electricity, flowing by a certain ridge line, let's say. I would say that this legislation should enfranchise them as owners, enfranchise the inhabitants in the surrounding towns in the viewshed, I would say, enfranchise them as owners of the wind rights. So then, if a corporation wants to generate electricity, they have to approach the owners of the wind rights and the owners of the land rights and make a deal, negotiate and make a deal. And that deal, I wouldn't know how that deal will shape up, but it'll certainly be more economically beneficial to the local residents than the situation that prevails now. And moreover, I think it would give them quite a stake in the energy transition, because in addition to negotiating over the economic benefits, they could negotiate over the siting of the turbines. They could negotiate over the size of them, of the design of them. There are all sorts of designs which have not actually been pursued because they're slightly less profitable to corporations. Usually they require more maintenance, which is to say jobs, and corporations don't want to expend that money. But that's something that might be negotiated differently and in an innovative way over jobs as well for the local communities.
Mm. So really, there's a place for sort of a national or even international, but I don't think I'd take that giant leap. But from a policy perspective, there's a place for a national declaration on wind rights and enshrining it in public policy by law. But we have to make sure that there's some flexibility within it so that those who are most directly affected, and that's largely people in rural areas right now anyway, have that there are economic benefits that accrue to them as well.
Right, correct, absolutely correct.
So in Spain, that never happened. Has there been any discussion moving forward about making it happen?
No, there has not, although it has happened just coincidentally. One of the largest wind farms in central Spain is in Zaragoza, on the central plateau, and that happens to be in publicly owned land. So you do have a publicly owned, and it's privately operated, but it's a publicly owned income stream from publicly owned wind rights in that farm. It's been much more popular than the strictly private wind farms. And there have been some like that in Germany. Again, that's not because of a decision on a wind commons. That's simply because they chose public land on which to site the wind farm.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the offshore wind farms being proposed for the entire eastern seaboard um, will function with publicly owned wind rights. But BOEM, the federal agency, Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, BOEM has been practically giving away the royalties to these corporations in order to incentivize the investment. So I don't believe there's going to be significant income coming from royalties to the federal government, even in that case.
Well, at least not yet. I mean, it would seem to me that's one of the sort of one of the easier jumps in terms of public policy is to say that uh, those wind farms that are built along the ocean, because they're not as controversial as those inland, um, and take place in sort of the more obviously public lands, ought to benefit everyone along the way.
Oh yeah, Wayne. I mean, one could apply the viewshed principle and say that the affected communities, both in terms of it's unclear what the effects will be, but and certainly within sight of the turbines and within historical fishing grounds of port communities, yeah, they could be enfranchised as owners of wind rights for offshore wind and get an income stream through a negotiation with the operator.
Mm-hmm.
But I have not seen that happening, not by a long shot.
Well, one of your big concerns is obviously that unless we conquer this challenge that you've laid out here in terms of making sure that there's justice along with energy, that we're not going to get the energy either.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you what's at stake here. As I said, Spain had the fourth highest what's called energy density of wind on the grid. That means the percentage of electricity on the grid that comes from wind was the fourth highest in the world, and that percentage reached 19% during the period during the late 2010s. It's up a couple percentage points higher now, I believe. But anyway. So that seems like a great achievement. It's much higher than what we have in the U.S. But electricity consumption went up by 20%. So you had 19% increase you had 19% of the energy coming from renewables, but 20% of the total, a 20% higher total. And so carbon emissions did not go down. I'm talking about over 20 years of building wind farms in Spain. Carbon emissions did not go down. They went up by 1 percentage point. So what we really need to do is to retire fossil fuels. And that's the most important thing. That's the thing that we need to do to preserve the conditions for life on planet Earth in terms of temperature, in terms of extreme weather events, fire, flood, drought. Most people would refer to those as natural conditions, but they're not natural anymore. They're driven by industry in part. But in any way, in terms of those conditions, we need to retire fossil fuels. Retiring fossil fuels, of course, creates a shortage of electricity in relation to what people consume. So we need to replace fossil fuels with something, and that ideally is wind and solar. Mm-hmm. But what's happening is that we're pursuing the second goal without pursuing the first goal. So what we're doing is continuing with fossil fuels at the same level, more or less, adding wind and solar to the grid in order to accommodate people's higher energy demands. In Spain, during this period of this 20-year build-out, it was people buying microwaves and so on. And we're not actually lowering carbon emissions. So we need to build renewables much faster, and we need to, first off, to make a commitment to retire fossil fuels much, much faster than is happening now.
I love the foundational ideas of your book, and I think about what might happen, for example, if we adopted nationally this carbon cashback model that was first proposed by George Shultz, interestingly enough, and Secretary Baker, where every American received a subsidy or received a dividend monthly or annually, that sort of offset the additional fees that were being levied on those who are producing carbon. If you did that, then there'd be the downward incentive on carbon and the upward incentive on green energy, and we'd probably have a better chance of achieving what you're discussing in the book.
Yes, I mean, the cap and dividend proposal is a great one, so long as the cap goes down very steeply. I don't think George Shultz actually wanted the cap to go down very fast, but there's a great paper coming out by a colleague of mine. One of the co-authors is Mark Paul at Rutgers. The Climate and Community Project will publish it, and it'll be talking about what's referred to as supply side restrictions. And cap and dividend is one of those. I'll tell you, but people could look for that in a month or two.
Well, David, you're appearing on a podcast called the Radical Centrist podcast, and you often say that that you started out as a cautious moderate in this project, but I think that you ended up as a radical centrist, and maybe more.
Well, I'm not quite sure what that phrase means, but I hang around a lot with climate activists who simply call themselves radicals. So what makes the book centrist, I think, is the way in which I take local history and local claims seriously. And if you want to retire fossil fuels at the global level, well, that's quite an enormous agenda, and there are various engineers and planners and economists who have plans to do this, but I don't think they're going to work at all because those plans don't take local particularities, local needs into account. So I say, meet people where they are, and the people in this village are not just centrist, but pretty right wing in Spanish terms. That would probably make them centrist, or even moderate Democrats in the U.S. Meeting people where they are, and there are remarkable things I find in the book. This village is very close to the Strait of Gibraltar, and that's a place where Africans are trying to get into Europe illegally by crossing in dinghies, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar from Morocco in dinghies and things. And the village votes pretty much for a party that's anti-immigration. And so I pretty much thought people didn't welcome immigrants. But then I learned that a few years before I had been there was actually an underground railroad operated by a couple of people in the village, supported by many more, and known by just about everybody, which brought these immigrants in at night and hosted them in this sort of abandoned house, and then funneled them north to where they got jobs in agriculture. And people who voted for the right-wing party said, well, of course we help. If somebody comes to me in need, I am going to help them. And I don't care where they're from. And so this is a common decency that operates in many communities of face-to-face relations across lines of national, racial, economic difference, and so on. And one of the frustrating things about this whole discussion about an energy transition is it's never put in those terms. So nobody who really needs wind turbines, and these are people, for example, nobody who really needs to retire fossil fuels, and these are people who might be living at sea level in Bangladesh and subject to sea level rise and cyclones and so on. Those people are never actually put face to face with us to ask for help, or in a position where we can make a decision to give them help by retiring fossil fuels in this face-to-face way. So I suppose that's a kind of a centrist way, because it's based on what I take to be an enormously widespread sense of decency. which would cuts across party lines, I believe. But it needs to be brought out in the context of face-to-face relations.
Right. I mean, I think that's the bottom line, is that the idea of centrist really relates to the notion that we need to listen to one another and to see one another in the process, and try and get beyond the ridiculous notions of liberal, conservative, left, right, in order to move forward.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying in the example of this underground railway for immigrants is that what people hold as a desired national policy is not necessarily at all what they hold as a desired neighborhood practice.
Right.
And so if we can make national and planetary level changes by working with neighborhood practices, I think we're going to get much further.
Mm-hmm. And your book really addresses or tries to make the case for tying together the two great national crises that we face right now, in my opinion. The first being climate change, and the second being income disparity. If you can begin to tie those together, that is kind of a magical formula for healing some of the divisions that exist, isn't it?
Well, this gets a little into universal basic income, I think. I mean,
yeah.
One of the well, so there is this concern that if we retire fossil fuels, what's going to happen to hundreds of thousands of people, I believe, who work in the United States, who work in oil, gas, and coal, and in cars fueled by oil, car parts, and so on. What's going to happen to those people? And the kind of green jobs approach is to say, well, they'll get jobs building and maintaining wind farms. And I'm honest, although, as I said, I very much support this transition away from fuels. I'm very honest in the book and say those jobs are not there. The energy transition is a construction project. And if we want to stabilize the conditions for life on planet Earth, it has to happen very quickly. So let's say it's a 10-year or 20-year construction project. And that's all right. That provides a job for half a career. But then what? What you find is that wind farms, once they're operating, take almost no labor. One of the managers of a farm in this Spanish village described the machines as robots. You know, they're really almost maintenance free, and solar panels even more so. And when you think about it, there's an obvious reason for that. The cleanness of clean energy means it's also sort of free of maintenance, right? When you dig up coal, well, somebody's got to dig it up or explode the mountaintop and then rake it off and put it on a truck or a train and drive it somewhere. And then you have the burning part of it. And then you have the ash, and somebody's got to drive that away and put that someplace else. So the extraction and the pollution provide a lot of jobs. You know, that's dirty, grimy business, and somebody's got to do it. And the jobs actually in the U.S. are pretty well paid for some of that. All you have in energy, in wind energy, is the throughput, the middle part. Mm-hmm. And the middle part, again, you know, is pretty well-oiled machine, right? So then what happens to all of those people? I think we need a better solution than a set of promises about green jobs that are not going to materialize. And so we have to recognize that, well, there's two ways of thinking about this. I like the example of the longshoremen. So the longshoremen also lost their way of life because of more efficient technology that came along. And although they were powerful through their longshoremen's union, they weren't able to mount as the fossil fuel industry has. They weren't able to mount an international campaign against new technology and in favor of old technology. They had to accept the new technology. So they negotiated with the big shipping companies in the 70s and 80s and said, okay, you want to replace us with these giant ships and containers and these giant cranes? You're going to make a lot of money doing that, even more than you're making now. And right now, you can afford to pay us all. So we want you to continue paying us. Just pay us. And, whether we work or not. And so they all got a career-long wage for working about 25% time. They got paid 100% time. And otherwise, they had a lot of free time for doing other things. There's a sociologist, Stanley DeFazio, who's written a great book about this. So that's one solution for the oil, gas, and coal industry, is that it becomes a renewables industry and it pays all those people for mostly not working. Although, having said that, there still will be a huge amount of work doing capping wells, oil and gas wells, to prevent leaks, and that'll be a generation of work as well. But then the other solution I propose really in the book, because this is more relevant for Spain, is that the federal government simply pay people what is a living wage as a universal basic income, to allow them to lead full lives, whether they have jobs or not. And, Kathy, I'll talk about another sociologist. Kathy Weeks wrote a great book about this. I can't remember the title, though. We have this bizarre arrangement in the United States. In most countries have a bizarre arrangement where the things that we value most, we actually pay the lowest wages for them, right? This has to do with the difference between value and price.
Right.
So, everybody would say that the thing that we really need people to do, and to do it pretty well, is to raise children, right? If you don't give birth to children and raise them, then we don't have any society. Yep. And if you raise them horribly, or if you ignore them completely, or raise them in abusive environments, or park them in front of the television for 18 years, they end up being unproductive workers or worse. So this is the thing that we really need to do. And we pay basically zero wages for that. That's something that parents, and particularly women, historically only women, were expected to do for free. And then we have a whole lot of stuff like managing websites and developing websites. I'm thinking of the kind of thing that, who is the guy, the Microsoft guy, or the Google guy, any of these billionaires.
Right. Bill Gates.
What these billionaires do is not that important, but they get billions of dollars for it. So anybody looking at this from outside would say, well, there's a real problem here. There's a real mismatch here. And maybe what we ought to do is tax some of the billionaires and use that money to support everybody for doing things like raising kids, like taking care of the elderly, like taking care of themselves, like being good neighbors. Here I'll stretch it a bit further, like planting a garden, like walking a dog, like playing the guitar, maybe just like sitting around and existing, because we all benefit from existence. Those people deserve a wage for that. Mm-hmm. And so if you get into this conversation where everybody has an assured wage and maybe assured health care, then a job starts to seem less important. And so I want to shift the conversation away from where Biden has it. Biden and all of his opponents have this conversation about jobs. And we need to make sure that everybody has a job. What you realize, and I've worked in the labor movement quite a bit, what you realize is that people don't really like their jobs that much. And very few people really want a job. What they want is money. They want a livelihood. They want sustenance. And if they can get that in some way other than a job, well, they might be even more happy. So let's not think of jobs as the be and end all of national economic policy.
Right. And the job that they choose as a result of having some kind of a universal basic income, the entrepreneurship that would likely come from that would have people actually choosing jobs that they wanted to do, as opposed to what they
Yes.
had to do.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, people are forced into jobs that they're not good at or not motivated to do because of the wage, or because of health insurance. And so this leads to general unhappiness and economic inefficiency, I would say.
Yeah. And I suppose we've gone a bit afield of the theme of your book, but I'd like to know how electric vehicles sort of fit into your thoughts on owning the wind and providing, generating and storing electricity.
Well, yeah, that is outside the book, but I have done some thinking about that. Um, so and on storage, Wayne. I mean, so one of the concerns raised opportunistically by supporters of oil is that, well, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and the sun doesn't shine all the time, and you generate electricity only intermittently when you rely upon those renewables, and therefore 100% renewable grid would need a way of storing a lot of electricity. And these people who say this often want to slow down the energy transition, and certainly not to. Right. They want to perpetuate oil and gas and coal, so they exaggerate this intermittency problem. Mm-hmm. There are lots of ways of solving it. There's a great the Prairie Institute in Minnesota did this great modeling where they planned so many wind farms and solar farms in the grid that goes from the mid-continent grid that goes from Minnesota to Louisiana, and they actually ran this model for a year on existing weather conditions, and they found that electricity from wind and solar always met demand in the Midwest because the sun was shining or the wind was blowing in enough places that without storage, they still met demand. So that's one method. If you want to store electricity, yeah, you can build battery farms, or you can use everybody's car if everybody drives a car with a battery. And one of the interesting ideas about that is that if you have smart meters on people's houses, then they can, and if they park somewhere where during the day where there's a solar canopy over a parking lot or something, they can, and that solar canopy those solar canopies all over the region are generating more electricity than you need. Well, the excess gets stored in the car batteries. People then, the commuters, drive those batteries out to wherever they live, which means that they're actually transporting energy as a kind of grid, a commuting grid, then decentralizing it out to those areas. And then during the peak hours, which is 4 to 8 p.m., ideally, the local users, their neighbors, would suck that electricity out through the grid and use it when the sun is no longer shining. Now, in order to have that happen, most people have proposed an incentive structure whereby the owner of the electric vehicle would make a lot of money by selling electricity between 4 and 8 p.m. at a higher rate. And maybe that's the way to go. A possible solution, which is going to sound more socialist, is to say, well, they don't have the option. The grid is going to draw power from that car between 4 and 8 p.m., whether the owner wants it or not. And that'll be possible because they won't own the battery. The battery will be owned by the state in some way, which means that the owner of the car will not have had to pay for the battery, and the car will be 1/3 to 1/2 the price of what it would otherwise cost. So basically, that's a way of saying the car is going to be your car, but the battery is going to be like the city bus that will be charged and discharged and used in various ways depending on the need of the community.
Right. But in any event, the between the rapid advances in artificial intelligence and a smart grid, those are both options that are not only feasible but quite attainable.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd also like to see policies that favored riding a bicycle, which is how I mostly get around, and taking a bus on frequent routes and free of a user fee, which is to say fare-free public transportation. There are all kinds of solutions that would get people into public transportation, which is still the most efficient way to get around because of the energy cost of building an electric car, which is very high.
Right. So the what you were able to glean from your studies, it is important in terms of listening to and talking with one another and trying to figure out how you fashion policy, whether it's local policy or broader public policy, to recognize the issues that local folks in the area who are affected by the energy transition can benefit from that. But one of the things that I think is that you have not you haven't had anything to study where that has been successful in that in Spain anyway. Have you seen a project anywhere where people have actually considered the fabric of communities and society and culture in the process of siting, whether it's wind turbines or anything else?
Well, I haven't seen that as a researcher. I have read about a place in New Zealand, and another place in Denmark. These are both examples I mention in the book, where this was again on public land, but these are places where there was a whole lot of public land and not a whole lot of private land. And the community got an income stream, and they also got a say in the siting and design of the turbines. They were painted in different ways in those cases. So yeah, those are some examples that I do mention in the book of where things have been done better.
So, as an answer, if somebody's just met you on the streets and said, "Who does own the wind?" how would you respond to that?
Well, I'd have to say that it's not, in a moral sense, the people own the wind, because it was not produced by any human being who could claim ownership, by any individual who could claim ownership, and because it is produced by forces at a planetary level that really don't belong to anybody. So if no individual owns it, we'd have to say that all people own it.
That we all
right. Now, in the legal sense, I'd have to say the law doesn't quite say that, and things are open to interpretation, including an interpretation entirely opposite to mine, which has been implemented, unfortunately, in many places. But this is an area of struggle, and it's a struggle worth having. So I would recommend that struggle to anybody in a windy place, to struggle for popular ownership of the wind, for a wind commons.
Right. And popular ownership of the wind would also serve the cause of economic justice as well in the process. Yes. And
yes,
that seems to be the bottom line of what you've said. And it's certainly an approach that ought to become public policy, in my opinion. And I thank you so much for speaking with me, David McDermott Hughes, and I hope that our paths cross again in the very near future.
They will cross, Wayne. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay.
Thank you for the listeners.
You take care.
You too.
Bye. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to take an editorial moment about this issue and suggest that those companies that manufacture and erect wind farms in the United States, whether they're on the ocean or land, and frankly any place else, would do themselves proud if they were to be the leading edge of a change like this that has been proposed by David Hughes. Imagine, if you will, that one company or two big companies that erected wind farms had a policy where they created benefits for everyone in the process. Imagine how that would boost their economic competitiveness among other companies that did the same sort of thing. This is my appeal to them and to public policymakers who are looking for ways to help increase the amount of renewable energy in our country and to lower the carbon output to zero. We need to look at how to change the public policies so that all the people are beneficiaries of the changes we make. We are about to enter what is a revolution in green energy. It's already going on, but it's only going to gain more and more traction as time goes on. And if we can harness that to bring about economic and environmental justice in the country, then we will have achieved probably the greatest technological and social revolution in our country's history since the founding. Thanks for listening to this, our first podcast of this 3-month special series called Rediscovering Our Song. And again, thanks to David Hughes and to our friend Free Joseph, reggae musician extraordinaire, for allowing us to use his song Tell Me Why as the theme song for the Radical Centrist. As Free says, we have got to learn to live together. And that's really what David McDermott Hughes has said during the content of this podcast, that we have got to harness, as Steve Schmidt said, the coalition of the decent in our country to move us forward in a way that is respectful of diverse opinions and beneficial to all. Thanks again for joining us on The Radical Centrist. The show notes for this podcast can be found at theradicalcentrist.us, where you can make a contribution, where you can purchase art that will benefit the podcast, and leave us your opinions and ideas. I truly would like to hear from people if you have someone specifically that we should feature in the next 3 months for our series called Rediscovering Our Song. Now take us out, Free.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch! Got to realize that we could do a bit better.